Nurse Kira Donaldson thought she was just doing what any decent person would do when she emptied her savings account to pay for a homeless man's life-saving surgery. She had no idea that this single act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just her life, but the lives of everyone in her struggling community. 7 days later, 3 impeccably dressed strangers walked through the doors of her rundown clinic, carrying an envelope that would change everything. The note inside was signed simply, "From the patient you never gave up on." But who was he really, and why did his gratitude come with the power to rebuild an entire neighborhood? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The fluorescent lights in St. Mary's Community Clinic flickered with their usual persistence, casting an uneven glow across the cramped waiting room where 23 people sat in various stages of discomfort and resignation. Kira Donaldson pushed through the heavy double doors that separated the waiting area from the treatment rooms, her worn sneakers squeaking against the linoleum floor that had seen better decades. At 28, she possessed the kind of quiet determination that comes from witnessing too much suffering and refusing to become numb to it. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her scrubs, though clean and pressed, showed the telltale signs of countless washings and long shifts. The clinic served the forgotten corners of downtown Portland, where hope often felt as scarce as the funding that kept their doors open. Kira had been working here for 4 years, ever since graduating from nursing school, with a mountain of student debt and an unwavering belief that healthcare should be a right, not a privilege. Dr. Martinez, the clinic's founder and sole physician, often joked that Kira's compassion would either save the world or bankrupt her. As it turned out, he wasn't entirely wrong on either count. That particular Tuesday morning started like any other, with a steady stream of patients whose stories painted a vivid picture of urban struggle. There was Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who rationed her diabetes medication because she couldn't afford both her prescriptions and groceries. Nigel, the construction worker whose untreated back injury had cost him 3 jobs in 6 months. Sarah, the teenage mother who brought her feverish baby enwrapped in a towel because she didn't own a proper blanket. Each case represented not just a medical condition, but a life balanced precariously on the edge of disaster. Kira moved between examination rooms with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, administering medications, and offering the kind of gentle reassurance that couldn't be taught in textbooks. She had learned early in her career that healing involved more than just treating symptoms. Sometimes it meant listening to an elderly man talk about his late wife while she cleaned his infected wound. Other times, it meant helping a mother understand her child's medication schedule in broken English, using hand gestures and infinite patience to bridge the language gap. The morning was progressing normally until the ambulance arrived. Kira heard the sirens long before she saw the flashing lights through the clinic's front windows. St. Mary's wasn't equipped for emergency services, but their location in the heart of the city's most neglected district meant they occasionally received overflow from the overcrowded county hospital. When the paramedics pushed through the doors with their patient, Kira's first thought was that this man needed more help than their modest facility could provide. He appeared to be in his early 60s, though the hard lines etched in his weathered face made it difficult to determine his exact age. His clothes were tattered and stained, the uniform of someone who had been living on the streets for an extended period. His hair and beard were gray and unkempt, and the smell of unwashed skin and old alcohol clung to him like a second skin. Most concerning of all was his shallow, labored breathing and the grayish pallor that had settled across his features. "Found and collapsed behind the Roosevelt Building," one of the paramedics explained as they transferred the unconscious man to the clinic's single gurney. "Looks like he's been sick for a while. County General is completely full, and he doesn't have insurance or identification. They asked if you could stabilize him and keep him comfortable until a bed opens up." Dr. Martinez appeared at Kira's shoulder, his expression grim as he quickly assessed the new patient. At 55, Martinez had seen enough medical emergencies to recognize the signs of serious trouble. His examination was thorough but swift, his hands moving with the confidence that came from 2 decades of treating Portland's most vulnerable populations. What he discovered made his jaw tighten with concern. "This man is in acute heart failure. Martinez announced quietly, pulling Kira aside so their conversation wouldn't be overheard by the other patients. His lungs are filling with fluid, his blood pressure is dangerously low, and without immediate intervention, he's not going to make it through the day. He needs surgery, specialized care, the kind of treatment that costs tens of thousands of dollars. End quote. Kira looked back at the man on the gurney, noting how his chest rose and fell with obvious effort. Something about his face, even in its current state of distress, suggested a dignity that transcended his circumstances. There was intelligence in his features, a hint of the person he might have been before whatever circumstances had led him to the streets. She had seen this look before, in homeless patients, the ghost of former selves that poverty and addiction and mental illness couldn't quite erase. "What are his options?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Martinez removed his stethoscope and ran a hand to his graying hair. "Honestly, without insurance, without family, without any way to pay, most facilities won't touch him. They'll give him some medication to make him comfortable and wait for the inevitable. The county hospital might take him eventually, but by then it could be too late." The weight of this reality settled between them like a stone. They both knew the cruel mathematics of American healthcare, where a person's ability to pay often determined not just the quality of treatment they received, but whether they received any meaningful treatment at all. It was a system that reduced human lives to spreadsheet calculations and insurance codes, and it was the reason why Kira had chosen to work in community health despite the financial sacrifices it required. "There has to be something we can do," Kira said, her voice carrying the edge of frustration that always appeared when she encountered the healthcare system's limitations. "We can't just let him die because he doesn't have the right paperwork." Martinez shared her frustration, but he also carried the additional burden of keeping the clinic financially viable. Every decision he made had to balance compassion with practicality, idealism with the harsh realities of operating a nonprofit organization in an underfunded sector. "Kira, I understand how you feel, and I wish things were different, but we're not equipped for cardiac surgery, even if we could afford to transfer him to a facility that could help. We're talking about a procedure that costs more than our entire annual budget." End quote. Over the next several hours, Kira found herself returning to the man's bedside between other patients. She monitored his vital signs, adjusted his medications, and tried to make him as comfortable as possible while his condition slowly deteriorated. During one of these visits, he briefly regained consciousness, his eyes opening to focus on her face with surprising clarity. "Am I dying, nurse?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a strange calmness that caught Kira off guard. She hesitated, unsure how to balance honesty with hope. "You're very sick," she finally answered. "We're doing everything we can to help you feel better." He nodded slightly, as if he had expected this response. "I don't have anyone," he said after a moment. "No family, no friends who'd claim me. Guess that makes things simpler." "Don't talk like that," Kira replied, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "Everyone has value. Everyone deserves a chance to get better." The man studied her face for a long moment, and Kira thought she detected something like surprise in his expression. "You really believe that, don't you?" he asked. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "I absolutely do." He closed his eyes again, but not before Kira caught what might have been the hint of a smile. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he murmured, his words trailing off as exhaustion overtook him. That afternoon, Dr. Martinez received a call from Portland General Hospital. They had a bed available and a cardiac surgeon willing to perform the necessary procedure, but the estimated cost would be $47,000. Without insurance or a financial guarantor, the hospital required payment in advance. It was a sum that might as well have been $47 million, for all the likelihood of raising it in time to save the man's life. Kira overheard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. She watched Martinez hang up the phone with an expression of defeat that she had rarely seen in their 4 years of working together. The reality of the situation was brutal in its simplicity. A human life hung in the balance, and the only thing standing between salvation and tragedy was money. That evening, after the last patient had been seen, and the clinic had grown quiet, Kira sat alone in the break room, staring at her laptop screen. Her online banking page displayed a number that represented 4 years of careful saving, countless skipped meals, and the sacrifice of small luxuries that most people took for granted. $41,312. It wasn't quite enough to cover the surgery, but it was close. Combined with what she could borrow on her credit cards and perhaps a small loan from the bank, it might be sufficient. The decision should have been impossible. No rational person empties their life savings for a stranger, especially not someone whose name they don't even know. Kira's student loans still demanded monthly payments. Her car was making concerning noises that probably indicated expensive repairs, and her own modest apartment was hardly a symbol of financial security. The money in her savings account represented her emergency fund, her safety net, her protection against the kind of financial catastrophe that could destroy years of careful planning. But as she sat in the dimly lit break room, listening to the sounds of the city beyond the clinic's walls, Kira found herself thinking about the man's words. "I don't have anyone." She thought about the clarity in his eyes when he asked if he was dying, and the way he had seemed surprised that she believed every person deserved a chance at survival. Most of all, she thought about the person she wanted to be, versus the person that financial prudence demanded she remain. At 11:47 p.m., Kira initiated the electronic transfer that would move her entire life savings to Portland General Hospital's payment system. Her hands shook slightly as she typed in the confirmation code, and she felt a mixture of terror and relief wash over her as the transaction completed. She had just committed financial suicide for a man whose name she didn't know, whose background remained a mystery, and whose chances of survival were far from guaranteed. The next morning brought a flurry of activity, as arrangements were made to transfer the patient to Portland General. Kira accompanied him in the ambulance, holding his hand during the short journey while he drifted in and out of consciousness. Just before they arrived at the hospital, he gripped her fingers with surprising strength and looked directly into her eyes. "Why?" he asked, and somehow she knew he wasn't asking about his medical condition. "Because everyone deserves a chance," she replied, echoing the words she had spoken the day before. He squeezed her hand once more. "What's your name, nurse?" "Kira," she told him. "Kira Donaldson." "Thank you, Kira Donaldson," he whispered. "I won't forget." The surgery was successful. Dr. Patricia Wong, the cardiac surgeon who performed the procedure, later described it as routine, despite the patient's advanced condition. The man's heart had been failing due to severe coronary artery disease, a condition that was entirely treatable with proper medical intervention. Within hours of the operation, his color improved dramatically, and his breathing became steady and strong. It was, Dr. Wong noted in her postoperative report, exactly the kind of case that demonstrated the tragedy of healthcare inequality. A readily treatable condition had nearly proven fatal, simply because the patient lacked the financial resources to access care. Kira visited him during his recovery, bringing flowers from the clinic's small garden and updates about the other patients who had been asking about him. He was sitting up in bed when she arrived, looking like a completely different person. Someone had helped him shower and shave, and the gray pallor had been replaced by healthy pink skin. Most remarkably, his eyes now held the bright intelligence she had glimpsed during his brief moments of consciousness. "You look wonderful," she said, and meant it. "I feel like I've been given a second life," he replied. "Which I suppose I have, thanks to you." They talked for nearly an hour, during which Kira learned that his name was Robert Harrison, and that his path to homelessness had been both typical and heartbreaking. He had been a high school English teacher for over 20 years, before a combination of budget cuts, depression following his wife's death, and a growing dependence on alcohol had cost him his job, his home, and eventually his self-respect. The streets had been his address for 3 years, during which time his health had steadily deteriorated, while his hope for recovery had all but disappeared. "I had given up," he admitted to Kira. "Not just on getting better, but on the idea that anyone would care whether I lived or died. When you paid for my surgery, when you sat with me and held my hand, you gave me something more valuable than medical treatment. You gave me back my humanity." 2 weeks later, Robert was discharged from the hospital with a clean bill of health, and a comprehensive treatment plan that would help him maintain his cardiac wellness. Kira had arranged for him to stay at a transitional housing facility that specialized in helping homeless individuals rebuild their lives. It wasn't a luxury accommodation, but it provided safety, stability, and the support services that Robert would need to successfully reintegrate into society. On the day of his discharge, Robert handed Kira a handwritten letter. "I want you to have this," he said. "It's not much, but it's the only way I know to express what you've done for me." The letter was written in careful cursive on hospital stationery, and it contained a level of eloquence and gratitude that brought tears to Kira's eyes. Robert wrote about the moment he realized he wasn't going to die alone and forgotten, about the kindness of strangers who had seen his humanity when he had forgotten it himself, and about his commitment to rebuilding his life in a way that would honor the gift he had received. At the bottom, he had signed it, "With eternal gratitude, the patient you never gave up on." Life at St. Mary's Community Clinic gradually returned to its normal rhythm of controlled chaos and quiet heroism. Kira continued to treat her patients with the same combination of medical expertise and genuine compassion that had defined her nursing career, though she now carried the additional stress of her drastically reduced financial situation. She had taken on extra shifts at a nearby hospital to help cover her basic expenses, and her diet consisted primarily of whatever samples the pharmaceutical representatives left behind during their visits to the clinic. The other staff members knew about her sacrifice, though Kira had asked them not to discuss it with patients or anyone outside the clinic. Dr. Martinez had initially been furious when he learned what she had done, not because he disagreed with her motivations, but because he was terrified about what would happen to her if she faced her own medical emergency or financial crisis. Their argument had been brief but intense, ending only when Kira pointed out that she would make the same decision again if faced with similar circumstances. "That's exactly what worries me," Martinez had replied, but his anger had been replaced by a grudging admiration for her principles, even if he questioned her judgment. Exactly 1 week after Robert's discharge, Kira was reviewing patient charts in the clinic's small office when the receptionist buzzed the intercom. "Kira, there are 3 men here to see you. They say it's important, and they're wearing suits." Kira looked up from her paperwork, puzzled. The only people who wore suits to St. Mary's were either government officials conducting inspections or pharmaceutical sales representatives, and neither group typically asked to speak with nurses specifically. She made her way to the front desk, where she found 3 impeccably dressed men waiting in the lobby. They appeared to be in their 30s or 40s, each carrying himself with the kind of confident posture that suggested successful careers and comfortable lives. The tallest of the 3 stepped forward as Kira approached. "Ms. Donaldson? My name is David Chen, and these are my colleagues, Michael Rodriguez and James Patterson. We were hoping we could speak with you privately for a few minutes." I'm sorry, but I don't think we have." Kira replace their face, and why 3 business? "Are you here about a patient?" David Chen smiled, and there was something warm and genuine in his expression that immediately put Kira at ease. "In a matter of speaking, yes. We're here because of Robert Harrison. He was a patient of yours recently." Kira felt a flicker of concern. "Is Robert all right? Has something happened to him?" "Robert is doing very well," Michael Rodriguez assured her. "In fact, he's doing better than he has in years. We're here because he asked us to deliver something to you personally." The third man, James Patterson, stepped forward carrying a manila envelope that appeared to contain several documents. "Ms. Donaldson, before we continue, I need to ask if there's somewhere private we could talk. What we have to discuss is somewhat confidential." Kira led them to the clinic's small conference room, a cramped space that was typically used for staff meetings and medical consultations. The 3 men arranged themselves around the narrow table while Kira took the seat at the head. Still confused about the purpose of their visit, but increasingly curious about their connection to Robert. David Chen opened the conversation by pulling out a business card and sliding it across the table to Kira. "Ms. Donaldson, I should start by explaining who we are and why Robert asked us to come see you. I'm the director of the Harrison Foundation, a charitable organization that focuses on healthcare access and homelessness prevention. Kira examined the business card, noting the expensive paper and embossed logo. The Harrison Foundation was not an organization she recognized, though given her focus on direct patient care rather than fundraising or administration, that wasn't particularly surprising. What did surprise her was the implication that Robert somehow had a connection to a BI foundation that could afford to print business cards on paper that probably cost more than most of her patients' monthly grocery budgets. I'm afraid I don't understand, Kira said. Robert is a homeless man, a former teacher who's been living on the streets. How does he know about your foundation? Michael Rodriguez and James Patterson exchanged a glance before Rodriguez answered. Ms. Donaldson, Robert Harrison is more than just a former teacher. He's also the founder and primary benefactor of the Harrison Foundation. Before his wife died, and before he lost his way, Robert was one of Portland's most successful businessmen and philanthropists. The room seemed to tilt slightly as Kira processed this information. The man she had saved, the homeless patient whose life she had ransomed with her savings, was actually a wealthy philanthropist? It seemed impossible, like something from a movie rather than real life. But he was living on the streets, she said weakly. He had nothing. No identification, no money, no way to pay for his medical care. That's all true, James Patterson confirmed. After his wife Margaret died of cancer, Robert fell into a deep depression. He started drinking heavily, made some poor business decisions, and eventually lost everything. He gave away most of his remaining assets to various charities and deliberately destroyed his identification documents because he said he wanted to disappear completely. For 3 years, he lived as if he truly had no resources, no connections, no safety net. David Chen leaned forward in his seat. But Robert never actually liquidated the foundation's endowment. He had established it as an independent entity years earlier, with a board of trustees and professional management. Even at his lowest point, even when he wanted to disappear from his old life completely, he couldn't bring himself to destroy the charitable work that had meant so much to Margaret. The foundation has been operating throughout Robert's absence, Rodriguez added. We've been waiting and hoping that he would eventually recover and return to his role as chairman. When he called us last week from the transitional housing facility, it was the first time we had heard from him in over 3 years. Kira sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the image of the desperate homeless man she had treated with the picture these men were painting of a successful philanthropist. It was almost too much to believe, except that it explained the intelligence she had seen in Robert's eyes and the eloquence of the letter he had written to her. Robert asked us to come see you because he wants to make sure you understand the full magnitude of what you did for him, Chen continued. You didn't just save his life medically. You reminded him that he was worth saving. Your act of kindness, your willingness to sacrifice your own financial security for a stranger, gave him the strength to reclaim his identity and his purpose. Patterson reached into the manila envelope and withdrew a thick document. Ms. Donaldson, Robert has asked the Foundation's Board of Trustees to approve a special initiative in your honor. We'd like to present you with this. He slid the document across the table, and Kira could see that it was some kind of official-looking contract or agreement. With trembling hands, Kira picked up the document and began to read. The legal language was crate, dense and formal, but the basic meaning became clear as she scanned the pages. The Harrison Foundation was establishing a permanent endowment to support St. Mary's Community Clinic, providing funding for facility improvements, equipment upgrades, and expanded services. The amount designated for this purpose was $2 million, to be distributed over 5 years with the possibility of renewal. I don't understand, Kira said, her voice barely above a whisper. This is too much. I didn't help Robert because I expected anything in return. I just did what anyone should do. That's exactly why Robert wanted to do this, Rodriguez replied. You proved that there are still people in the world who act based on compassion rather than calculation. The Foundation's board unanimously approved this grant because we believe St. Mary's represents the kind of healthcare delivery that should be supported and expanded. Chen pulled out another document. There's more, Ms. Donaldson. Robert has also asked us to establish a scholarship fund in your name for nursing students who want to work in community health. The Kira Donaldson Nursing Excellence Fund will provide full tuition assistance for students who commit to spending at least 2 years working in underserved communities after graduation. And this is for you personally, Patterson said, withdrawing a final envelope from his briefcase. Robert insisted that we reimburse you for the medical expenses you covered, plus interest, plus a little extra to TA. Recognize the sacrifice you made. Kira opened the envelope to find a cashier's check made out to her for $65,000. The amount was more than she had spent on Robert's surgery, more than she had earned in her entire first year as a nurse. It was enough to pay off a significant portion of her student loans, to buy a reliable car, to establish the kind of emergency fund that would provide genuine financial security. Robert wanted us to give you a message, Shen said, as Kira stared at the check in disbelief. He sent to tell you that kindness is the only investment that never fails to pay dividends. He also said that you shouldn't feel guilty about accepting this money, because it's not charity. It's a recognition of value, both the value of what you did for him and the value of the work you continue to do every day. Where is Robert now? Kira asked. I'd like to thank him, to tell him that this is more than I ever could have imagined. He's in Seattle, Rodriguez answered. He's been working with our board to restructure the foundation's priorities. He wants to focus more resources on direct patient assistance, helping people who fall through the cracks of the healthcare system. He said you gave him a new understanding of what it means to truly help people, rather than just writing checks to feel good about himself. Patterson stood up and began gathering the documents. Robert also asked us to tell you that he's been sober for 2 weeks now, that he's found an apartment, and that he's considering returning to teaching. He said none of that would have been possible if you hadn't shown him that his life still had value. Over the following months, St. Mary's Community Clinic underwent a transformation that amazed both the staff and the patients they served. The Harrison Foundation's funding allowed them to renovate the facility, replacing the flickering fluorescent lights with modern LED fixtures, installing new examination equipment, and creating a proper waiting area with comfortable seating and current magazines. They were able to hire 2 additional nurses and a part-time social worker, dramatically reducing wait times and improving the quality of care they could provide. The Kira Donaldson Nursing Excellence Fund received its first applications within 6 months of being established. 12 nursing students from across the Pacific Northwest applied for the scholarships, each writing essays about their commitment to serving underserved populations. The selection committee, which included Kira as well as representatives from several nursing schools, ultimately chose 4 recipients whose stories and dedication reminded everyone involved of why healthcare should be a calling rather than just a career. Kira used her reimbursement check to pay off more than half of her student loans and to establish her own emergency fund, but she also made a donation to the clinic's patient assistance program that would help cover medical expenses for people who couldn't afford care. Dr. Martinez joked that she was incorrigible, but he also acknowledged that her example had inspired the entire staff to think more creatively about how they could help their patients overcome financial barriers. To treatment. 6 months after the 3 businessmen had visited the clinic, Kira received a letter postmarked from Seattle. The return address showed the name Robert Harrison, and inside was a brief note written in the same careful cursive she remembered from the letter he had given her at the hospital. Dear Kira, the letter began. I wanted you to know that I've been teaching again for 3 months now, working with adult literacy students at a community college. Many of my students are people who, like me, lost their way for a while, that are trying to rebuild their lives. When they get discouraged, when they think they're not worth the effort, I tell them about a nurse who once saved a stranger's life with money she couldn't afford to spend. I tell them that if someone they had never met could see their value, then maybe they should try to see it too. Your kindness continues to ripple outward in ways you'll never fully know. With gratitude always, the patient you never gave up on. End quote. 2 years later, St. Mary's Community Clinic had become a model for community health centers across the region. Medical students from Oregon Health Science University rotated through the facility as part of their training, learning not just about treating diseases, but about treating people with dignity and respect, regardless of their ability to pay. The clinic's patient satisfaction scores were among the highest in the state, and their success in managing chronic diseases in underserved populations had attracted attention from health policy researchers and government officials. Kira had been promoted to head nurse and was working on her master's degree in nursing administration, with plans to eventually open additional community health centers in underserved areas. She often thought about the moment she had decided to empty her savings account for a stranger, and how that single decision had created ripple effects she never could have anticipated. The financial sacrifice that had seemed so enormous at the time had been returned to her many times over, not just in monetary terms, but in the satisfaction of knowing that her actions had helped transform an entire community's access to healthcare. The story of Kira's sacrifice and Robert's gratitude eventually became something of a legend in Portland's medical community. Nursing schools used it as an example of the profession's highest values, and medical ethicists pointed to it as a demonstration of how individual acts of compassion could address systemic healthcare inequities. But for Kira, the most meaningful outcome was much simpler. She had saved a man's life, and in doing so, she had discovered that the most important investments we make are not in stocks or bonds or savings accounts, but in each other. During quiet moments at the clinic, when the last patient had been seen and the paperwork was finally complete, Kira would sometimes think about the randomness of that Tuesday morning when the ambulance had brought Robert to their doors. She wondered how many other people were out there, invisible and forgotten, whose lives could be transformed by simple acts of human kindness. She thought about the 3 businessmen in suits who had walked through their doors with an envelope, and how their visit had proven that generosity is contagious, that one person's compassion can inspire others to acts of extraordinary charity. Most of all, she thought about Robert's words. Kindness is the only investment that never fails to pay dividends. In her 4 years at St. Mary's before that transformative Tuesday, Kira had seen plenty of evidence that the world could be cruel and unfair, that systems designed to help people often failed them, and that good intentions weren't always enough to overcome structural inequalities. But she had also seen evidence of something else: the persistent human capacity for love, sacrifice, and hope. The morning sun streaming through the clinic's new windows caught the framed letter on Kira's desk, the one signed by "The Patient You Never Gave Up On." It served as a daily reminder that every person who walked through their doors carried within them the potential for transformation, both their own and that of everyone whose lives they touched. It reminded her that healthcare, at its best, was not just about treating diseases, but about affirming the fundamental value and dignity of every human being. In the end, Kira realized, that was the real lesson of Robert's story. Not that good deeds are always rewarded, though sometimes they are. Not that sacrifice is always recognized, though sometimes it is. The real lesson was simpler and more profound, that in a world full of suffering and injustice, the choice to act with compassion is always available to us. Sometimes that choice costs us everything we have. Sometimes it costs us nothing at all. But it always matters. As she prepared for another day of treating patients who couldn't afford to be sick, who juggled impossible choices between medication and groceries, between doctor visits and rent payments, Kira carried with her the knowledge that small acts of kindness could have enormous consequences. She knew that the homeless man sleeping in the park across from the clinic might be a former teacher, a lost philanthropist, or simply someone who needed to be reminded that his life had value. She knew that the scared teenage mother in examination room 2 deserved the same level of care and respect as the wealthiest patient at the city's most exclusive hospitals. And she knew that every day presented new opportunities to choose compassion over convenience, generosity over self-preservation, hope over despair. It was a choice she had made once with her life savings, but it was also a choice she made dozens of times each day in smaller ways. Staying late to comfort a worried parent, taking time to explain a diagnosis in words a patient could understand, advocating for someone who had no voice in the healthcare system that was supposed to serve them. The story of the nurse who covered hospital bills for a homeless patient and the 3 strangers who walked into her clinic with an envelope became a testament to the power of individual action in the face of systemic problems. It proved that one person's decision to act with courage and compassion could create ripple effects that extended far beyond anything they had imagined possible. And it demonstrated that sometimes, when we give up what we think we cannot afford to lose, we discover riches we never knew existed. In the years that followed, as Kira continued her work at St. Mary's and watched the clinic grow into a beacon of hope for Portland's most vulnerable residents, she never forgot the lesson Robert had taught her. That kindness is the only investment that never fails to pay dividends. It was a lesson she passed on to her nursing students, to her colleagues, and to anyone who wondered whether individual actions could make a difference in a world full of seemingly insurmountable problems. 3 years after the envelope had arrived, Kira received an unexpected phone call that would once again test her faith in the power of human connection. The caller identified himself as Detective Ryan Cooper from the Portland Police Bureau, and his voice carried the kind of weariness that comes from delivering difficult news to families who are already struggling. "Ms. Donaldson, I'm calling about a patient you treated several years ago, a man named Robert Harrison. I understand you had a significant interaction with him when he was homeless." Kira's heart immediately began racing. "Has something happened to Robert? Is he all right?" "Mr. Harrison is fine," Detective Cooper quickly assured her. "Actually, he's the reason I'm calling. We have a situation here at the downtown precinct, and Mr. Harrison suggested we contact you. We've got a young woman in custody, 22 years old, arrested for shoplifting baby formula and diapers. Normally, this would be a straightforward case, but there are some complications." The detective went on to explain that the young woman, whose name was Isabella Martinez, had been living in her car with her 8-month-old daughter for the past 2 weeks. She had been working 2 part-time jobs until one of her employers reduced her hours, leaving her unable to afford both rent and basic necessities for her child. The shoplifting charge would likely result in jail time, which meant her daughter would be placed in the foster care system. Mr. Harrison heard about the case through his foundation's connections with local social services. Detective Cooper continued. He said that if anyone would understand how to help someone who's fallen through the cracks of the system, it would be you. He asked if I would call and see if you might be willing to meet with this young woman. Kira didn't hesitate. "Where is she now?" "She's here at the precinct, but we're releasing her on her own recognizance. The problem is, she has nowhere to go, and social services can't place her and the baby together on such short notice. Mr. Harrison has offered to cover the cost of temporary housing, but the young woman is refusing help from strangers. She says she doesn't trust people she doesn't know." That evening, Kira found herself sitting in a small interview room at the downtown police station, facing a young woman whose exhaustion was visible in every line of her body. Isabella Martinez had dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her clothes showed the wrinkled evidence of someone who had been sleeping in a car. Her baby daughter, Sophia, slept peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the crisis that surrounded her young life. "I'm not a criminal," Isabella said before Kira had a chance to introduce herself properly. "I know what it looks like, but I've never stolen anything in my life. I didn't know what else to do." She was crying because she was hungry, and I didn't have enough formula to last until my next paycheck. Kira studied the young woman's face, seeing echoes of every desperate parent who had ever brought a sick child to St. Mary's Clinic, knowing they couldn't afford the treatment. "What happened to your housing?" she asked gently. "My roommate moved out without warning and stuck me with the full rent," Isabella explained, her voice cracking slightly. "I had been splitting a 1-bedroom apartment with her, sleeping on the couch so Sophia could have the bedroom. When she left, the landlord said I had to pay the full amount or be evicted. I chose to keep my daughter fed instead of keeping the apartment." The story that emerged over the next hour was both heartbreaking and frustratingly common. Isabella had been working as a certified nursing assistant at a BEA local care facility while also taking classes toward her registered nursing degree. When her daughter's father abandoned them shortly after Sophia's birth, Isabella had been forced to drop out of school and take on additional work to support them both. The care facility had recently reduced her hours due to budget cuts, and her second job at a retail store provided palia, only minimum wage with no benefits. "I know I made a mistake," Isabella continued. "I know stealing is wrong, no matter what the circumstances. But when your baby is crying from hunger and you're holding an empty formula container, rational thinking kind of goes out the window. Kira felt a familiar stirring of the same emotion that had driven her to empty her savings account for Robert's surgery. Here was another person whose life had been derailed by circumstances beyond her control. Someone whose only crime was trying to care for a child in a system that made it nearly impossible for single mothers to survive on minimum-wage jobs. "Isabella, I want you to listen to me carefully," Kira said, leaning forward in her chair. "You're not the first person to face an impossible choice between following the law and taking care of someone you love. The fact that you chose your daughter's welfare over your own safety tells me everything I need to know about the kind of person you are." "But I still broke the law," Isabella replied. "I still have to face the consequences." "Yes, you do," Kira acknowledged, "but that doesn't mean you have to face them alone. There are people who want to help you, people who understand that sometimes good people end up in bad situations through no fault of their own." Over the next several days, Kira worked with Robert Harrison and the Harrison Foundation to develop a comprehensive support plan for Isabella and Sophia. The foundation covered the cost of a small apartment for Cal, 6 months, giving Isabella time to stabilize her employment situation. They also provided funding for childcare so that Isabella could return to her nursing program and complete her degree. But perhaps most importantly, Kira offered Isabella something that money couldn't buy: a job at St. Mary's Clinic as a nursing assistant, with the understanding that her schedule would be flexible enough to accommodate her school commitments. It was the kind of opportunity that Isabella had been desperately seeking, a chance to build a career in healthcare while supporting her daughter. "Why are you doing this for me?" Isabella asked during her first week at the clinic. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Why would strangers care about what happens to us?" Kira smiled, remembering asking Robert a similar question when he had first told her about the foundation's plans for the clinic. "Because someone once told me that kindness is the only investment that never fails to pay dividends. When people helped me, they weren't really helping me for my sake. They were helping me because they understood that we're all connected, that lifting up one person strengthens the entire community." Isabella proved to be an exceptional employee, bringing to her work the same fierce dedication that had driven her to risk arrest rather than let her daughter go hungry. Her experience as a single mother, struggling to navigate the civilized healthcare system, gave her unique insight into the challenges faced by many of the clinic's patients. She could speak to teenage mothers about the reality of balancing education and childcare, and she understood the impossible mathematics that forced families to choose between medications and groceries. 6 months later, Isabella received her nursing degree and was offered a full-time position at St. Mary's as a registered nurse. The charges related to her shoplifting incident had been reduced to community service, which she completed by volunteering at a local food bank that served families in crisis. Sophia, now walking and babbling in both English and Spanish, had become something of a clinic mascot, charming patients and staff with her sunny disposition. The ripple effects of Kira's original act of kindness continued to expand in unexpected directions. Isabella's success story became a model for how the Harrison Foundation could help other single parents who were struggling to balance education, employment, and childcare. The foundation established a scholarship program specifically for nursing students who were also parents, providing not just tuition assistance, but also support for childcare, housing, and other basic needs. Robert Harrison, now fully restored to his role as the foundation's chairman, often visited St. Mary's Clinic to see firsthand how their funding was being used. During one of these visits, he pulled Kira aside for a private conversation that would lead to the next chapter in her ongoing mission to expand access to healthcare. "Kira, I've been thinking about something," Robert said as they stood in the clinic's newly renovated break room. "The work you're doing here is remarkable, but it's also limited by geography. There are communities all over the Pacific Northwest that could benefit from this model of care. What would you think about opening additional clinics?" The idea was both exciting and daunting. Kira had often thought about the thousands of people who lived in rural areas or small towns without access to affordable health care, people who faced hours-long drives to reach the nearest medical facility. The success of St. Mary's had proven that community-based care could be both effective and financially sustainable. But expanding to multiple locations would require resources and expertise that seemed almost impossible to assemble. I've been looking at demographic data and health outcomes across Oregon and Washington, Robert continued. There are at least a dozen communities that desperately need what you've built here. The Foundation's board has approved a 5-year, $10 million initiative to establish a network of community health centers based on BRAF, the St. Mary's model. The conversation that followed stretched late into the evening, as Kira and Robert began sketching out the framework for what would eventually become the Pacific Northwest Community Health Network. The plan called for establishing clinics in underserved areas, each staffed by nurses and physicians who shared Kira's commitment to treating patients as whole human beings, rather than collections of symptoms and insurance codes. Isabella, who had been listening from the doorway, finally stepped into the room. "If you're serious about this expansion, I'd like to volunteer to help set up the first new clinic," she said. "I know what it's like to need health care and not be able to afford it. I know how it feels to be treated like you're less crine, worthy of care because you can't pay up front. If we can prevent other families from going through what Sophia and I experienced, then I want to be part of that effort." End quote. The first satellite clinic opened 18 months later in the small town of Roseburg, Oregon, a community that had been without a local healthcare provider for over 2 years after their only physician retired and no BRAF replacement could be found. The clinic was housed in a renovated storefront on the town's main street, and it was staffed by Isabella, who had recently completed additional training in family practice nursing, along with a part-time physician who split his time between Roseburg and 2 other rural communities. The opening day drew a line of patients that stretched around the block, a testament to the desperate need for accessible health care in rural America. Elderly residents who had been rationing their medications came in for medication reviews and chronic disease management. Young families brought children for immunizations and routine checkups that had been delayed for months due to the lack of local providers. Farm workers sought treatment for injuries that had been ignored because the nearest emergency room was 90 minutes away. Among the first patients was an elderly man named Frank Wilson, a retired logger who had been living with untreated diabetes for over a year because he couldn't afford the drive to the nearest endocrinologist. His blood sugar levels were dangerously high, and he was showing early signs of the complications that can make diabetes a life-threatening condition. "I figured I'd just tough it out until my time was up," Frank told Isabella during his initial appointment. "Didn't seem right to burden my kids with medical bills when there wasn't much they could do for an old man anyway." Isabella spent nearly an hour with Frank, not just checking his blood sugar and adjusting his medications, but also talking with him about his grandchildren, his years working in the forest, and his concerns about becoming a financial burden on his family. By the end of the appointment, Frank had a comprehensive diabetes management plan, a prescription for affordable medications, and a follow-up appointment scheduled for the following week. "Nobody's talked to me like that since my wife passed," Frank said as he prepared to leave. "Like I was still a person worth listening to. Thank you for that, nurse." The success of the Roseburg Clinic led to additional locations in Astoria, Pendleton, and eventually 12 communities across Oregon and Washington. Each clinic was tailored to the specific needs of its community, but all of them operated on the same principle that had guided Kira's work at St. Mary's, that quality health care should be accessible to everyone, regardless of their ability to pay. As the network grew, so did the number of stories about lives transformed by compassionate care. There was Maria, the undocumented immigrant who finally received treatment for her high blood pressure after years of living in fear that seeking medical care would lead to deportation. There was David, the unemployed construction worker who was diagnosed and treated for depression after months of self-medicating with alcohol. There was Sarah, the teenage mother who received not just prenatal care, but also education about parenting, nutrition, and family planning. Each story reinforced the lesson that Kira had learned from Robert, that kindness creates ripples that extend far beyond the original act of compassion. Every patient who received care at one of the network's clinics went home to families and communities, carrying with them not just better health, but also the knowledge that they were valued and deserving of care. 5 years after the first envelope had arrived at St. Mary's Clinic, Kira found herself standing at a podium in front of 500 healthcare professionals, community leaders, and philanthropists gathered for the annual Pacific Northwest Public Health Conference. She had been invited to deliver the keynote address about the Community Health Center network, but as she looked out at the audience, she found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 5 years ago, I was a nurse working in a struggling community clinic, treating patients who couldn't afford to be sick, she began. I thought I understood what it meant to provide compassionate care, but I had no idea how much I still had to learn about the connection between individual kindness and systemic change. She told the story of Robert Harrison, the homeless man whose life had been saved by a combination of medical intervention and human compassion. She talked about Isabella Martinez, the young mother whose desperate act had led to a new life and career in healthcare. She described the dozens of communities that now had access to quality medical care because one act of kindness had inspired a movement of generosity and service. I used to think that the biggest barriers to healthcare access were financial, that if we could just find ways to pay for treatment, we could solve the problems of medical inequality, Kira continued. But I've learned that the real barriers are often much deeper. They're about dignity, respect, and the simple human need to be seen and valued. When we treat patients as whole human beings, rather than medical cases, when we listen to their stories and acknowledge their struggles, we're not just providing health care, we're affirming their fundamental worth as people." End quote. The audience listened in rapt attention as Kira described the evolution of the Community Health Network, the challenges they had overcome, and the victories they had achieved. But the most powerful moment came when she introduced Isabella, who had been sitting in the front row with Sophia, now a precocious 4-year-old who was starting preschool in the fall. "I want you to meet someone who embodies everything I've been talking about," Kira said, gesturing for Isabella to join her on stage. 5 years ago, Isabella was arrested for shoplifting baby formula because she couldn't afford to feed her daughter. Today, she's a registered nurse who has helped establish 3 of our rural clinics and is currently pursuing her master's degree in public health. Her transformation didn't happen because someone gave her money. It happened because someone saw her potential and gave her the opportunity to fulfill it. End quote. Isabella's voice shook slightly as she addressed the audience, but her message was clear and powerful. "I'm not standing here today because I was rescued by charity," she said. "I'm here because people invested in my ability to contribute to my community. They didn't just help me when I was down. They empowered me to help others who are facing the same struggles I once faced." The conference marked a turning point for the Pacific Northwest Community Health Network, as additional foundations and government agencies expressed interest in supporting their expansion efforts. But for Kira, the most meaningful recognition came in the form of a handwritten letter that arrived at her office the following week. It was from Frank Wilson, the elderly diabetic who had been one of the first patients at the Roseburg Clinic. "Dear Nurse Kira," the letter began in careful cursive handwriting. "I wanted you to know that my granddaughter Emma has decided to become a nurse because of the care she saw you and your staff provide to our family. She says she wants to help people the way you helped her grandpa. I thought you should know that your kindness is inspiring the next generation of caregivers." As Kira read Frank's letter, she reflected on the remarkable journey that had begun with a simple decision to empty her savings account for a stranger. That single act of compassion had created a cascade of kindness that now touched thousands of lives across the Pacific Northwest. The homeless man she had saved had become a philanthropist dedicated to expanding healthcare access. The desperate mother she had helped had become a healthcare provider, serving rural communities. The elderly diabetic who had given up hope had inspired his granddaughter to pursue a career in nursing. The network of clinics had grown to employ over 200 healthcare professionals, social workers, and support staff, all united by a shared commitment to treating patients with dignity and respect. They had provided care to more than 50,000 people who might otherwise have gone without treatment, and their success had inspired similar initiatives in other regions across the country. But perhaps most importantly, they had proven that individual acts of kindness, when supported by systemic thinking and adequate resources, could create lasting change in entire communities. They had demonstrated that healthcare could be both compassionate and sustainable, that treating patients as whole human beings rather than profit centers could actually improve both health outcomes and financial performance. The answer she knew from experience, was always